Okay, good afternoon. I hope everyone is awake. I've had like 2 coffees already just to stay awake. I'm going to be talking about present and future of proton therapy. The talk is primarily emphasis on pediatrics. I believe that the future depends on how we treat our children, right? And the children are critical because the way we treat them, it's the way how we develop science, engineering, medicine. And pediatrics are a unique population that is very sensitive to radiation, and I'm going to show this part, okay? Okay, so first, I have to give you an overview. Since the population here is primarily particle physics and maybe nuclear and atomic physics, I want to give you an overview of what is particle therapy so that you get a feel for it. So the key thing that we want with particles is to avoid, first to treat the tumor. And the tumor is the critical thing that we want to do. And so if we use a standard photon beam, this looks like this. You have a very hot area right in the beginning, and then you have a very exponential fall-off of the radiation, and the tumor gets some amount of dose. But you see immediately that there is radiation upstream of the tumor and downstream. And so the way we do this with photons is we use a lot of beams. We don't use only one beam, we use a variety of beams. And so it's immediate that there is radiation also downstream. With protons, the Bragg peak creates an advantage that allows us to spare organs that are downstream from the tumor. So here, for example, if I had an organ, and in this end area, this organ would get basically 0 amount of radiation. And just to give you an idea of a situation where this is the case, you could have a tumor just sitting behind the eye, or the prostate cancer, for example, the most sensitive organ in the prostate area is the rectum. So if we shoot at the prostate and we hit the rectum will provide a lot of side effects. And the most complicated is rectal bleeding. It's pretty intense, and it's one of the severe side effects. And it's not the only one. In the spinal cord is another one. When we're treating spinal tumors, the spinal cord is very sensitive to radiation. And in those cases, you also have a severe situation. And this is what we call the organ-sparing region, and this is the huge advantage of particles. So particles allow us to significantly reduce radiation to critical organs. And the big advantage is we also reduce the number of beams, so the complication of the plan is reduced. So you have, basically with 1 or 2 beams, you can achieve almost the coverage of your tumor without the need of 10, 12, 15 beams, which is the standard practice when you do photon therapy. So here's a wonderful image, and it comes from Oncoray in Dresden. This is really not real at the moment, but I want to show you what happens if you do. So this is a brain tumor sitting right here in the middle of the brain. You have the red lights. The red lights are positioning systems for the patient to be positioned for treatment. And you have a particle beam coming in, hitting a tumor in the brain. And in case of the brain, nearly all the region of the brain is very sensitive. The most sensitive, in fact, is the hippocampus, but there's a variety of regions which are very, very sensitive to radiation. So this is what we want to achieve one day when we do particle therapy, full control of the beam, 1 or 2 beams hitting the tumor, and that's it. So now let's come to the real drive of my presentation. When I got involved with Gaspar about 2 years ago, one of his visions was to develop proton therapy in Portugal. And I think his main idea was to do something similar to what you have in Zurich. So at PSI, you have a very good physics research center, which has an outpatient facility. So this is an outpatient facility. It's not a hospital. And in this outpatient facility, you can treat patients, and you can also do research and develop the technique. And here you have, for example, the gantry, and you have your patient who will sit on that gantry, and you have your treatment beam that will come in. Outpatient facilities are pretty common in some centers, although many of them now are hospital-based facilities because of the caption area. You need to have patients from that hospital to come in, right? But this is what would work, for example, here in Portugal. Okay, the other thing is you have to understand what cancer is. Before we can move on, and I give more of the talk, in cancer, the cells have gained the capacity of unlimited division. So basically, they keep dividing and dividing and dividing, and they don't stop dividing. So the volume just goes out of proportion, and they don't stop. Now, if you think of a volume of like 100%, not all of them have this capacity to unlimited division, okay? In fact, it's a very small minority. It's around 2%, and they are usually called the stem cells. So the stem cells are roughly 2% of your volume, and they are the ones that drive growth of the tumor. The problem is they are like the mafia. I usually try to explain this. My wife doesn't really like this very much because she's Italian, but it's like the mafia, okay? The mafia, at one moment you have some cells which are cancer stem cells, and at the next moment they are not. So they swap around a lot. So you never know who the head is. You know it's somewhere in the volume, right? And they're constantly moving around. And the position, one thing we do know is these stem cells tend to be located in the most hypoxic regions. But they're not always the same, okay? So when we treat a volume, we treat the whole volume to hit those stem cells, okay? The other 98% we don't really care about, in fact. If we could just kill the 2%, we would be happy. The problem is knowing which ones are them. This is really the issue. Okay, so now I'm going to come back to Portugal, okay? So cancer is now one of the two biggest, let's say, mortality reasons in Portugal. You have cardiovascular and you have cancer. And in fact, this is a few years old, and I believe cancer has gone past cardiovascular now. But you see clearly here there's a huge amount of patients that are having cancer that require treatment and are very critical. And these cancers vary from a variety of things. Here is more or less the spread of cancer in Portugal. It varies from a variety of things, from colorectal to breast, prostate, lung. And the population now, from 2018, is 55,000 patients are getting cancer every year. So it's a huge cancer incidence number. Okay? Of these 55,000 patients, 50%, at least 50% will get radiation. So that's a huge population that needs treatment. Now, the spread varies from cervical to breast to stomach to lung. In fact, the biggest in Portugal is not lung, which is the one that's the biggest in the US. I think it's stomach and brain and nervous central system, so it varies. Each country has it, but they tend to be the standard ones, lung, breast, and prostate, but lung is now the one that's become dominant in most of the places. And here are the numbers. Liver are increasing, brain, colorectal, lung. The ones that are decreasing are, for example, stomach and cervical. Okay? And this is the age group of these cancer population in Portugal. And you notice that the majority of the patients are getting older. So you have 5 age groups, under 5 to 14-year-olds, 15 to 49, 50 to 69, and 70 plus. You have the aging population that's getting more and more cancer, and you have the young population that's less and less, of course. But there's still, if you add these two numbers, 100 kids, 100 pediatric patients under 14 every year that get cancer. That's a big number. So I want you to put yourself in the position of a parent. Forget the fact you're a physicist or a scientist. Think of it as a parent. If your son and daughter gets cancer, what would you do? Now, this is not an easy question to answer, but you just keep that in mind. So, where does protons come into this? Okay, there has been a study in Japan by Hiroko Tsui. They found that the optimal number is 15% of these X-ray patients. So 15% of 50%. So it's roughly 4,000 patients a year in Portugal can benefit from protons. In fact, the Japanese divided the study into protons and carbon. I just put the two numbers together to give you a total number. So 4,000 patients a year in Portugal, which have the most complicated cancers and the most resistant, would benefit from protons. So these 15% are not just any random number. They are usually the most complicated to treat and the hardest to treat. And it includes, of course, pediatrics. So, in Portugal, I hope everyone knows where Portugal is, of course, but this is wonderful. You notice there is a black hole of centers. There is nothing here for particle therapy. While in the rest of Europe, it's evolved, and we have a huge number of proton centers, and these blue dots represent dual centers with protons and carbon. In fact, this is about 2 years old, this graph. There are now 2 new centers in planning in Madrid. Both of them at private hospitals, okay? So it seems like Portugal is the only one that's missing on this technology, which is critical, okay? In the UK, the whole thing was stimulated by children. So 5 years ago, I was interviewed about a certain kid called Asia King that was treated in Southampton for cranial spinal cancer, okay? And they asked me, why the hell would I use protons if they had top-of-the-range technology in Southampton? And I will show you why in a few minutes, okay? This kid was kidnapped by the parents who did not want to give them standard treatment in Southampton, which was X-ray therapy. It was taken to the Czech Republic for proton therapy. What happened is the doctors in Southampton put out a national arrest warrant for the parents who had kidnapped their own son, and they were caught in Spain, of course. This is critical. That shows that your parents are always trying to do the best for you, and sometimes the doctors and the environment doesn't understand that. We have to really pay attention to that. Treating children is not an easy situation, but it is critical that we have the best quality technology we have available to do that. If not, we will not provide them the best quality treatment. So there are roughly 89 centers in operations at the moment in 20 countries. In Europe, in the two biggest centers are in US, primarily only protons, and the Japanese, protons and carbon. The Japanese are the leaders for carbon therapy, in fact. And Germany, we have a mix of both protons and carbon, and then the variety of other centers spread out in Europe. There are 77 new planned centers, 2 in Spain, 1 in Belgium, and 2 more in Norway, which was not on the map. So in total, there are 166 centers in 31 countries. It's growing. Protons have become critical, and it's become important. The population has grown significantly, and it's growing at an exponential rate. The biggest treating center is Loma Linda, which is in California. If you know where San Bernardino is, it's about 1 hour west of Los Angeles. This is where University of Loma Linda is, and they've treated over 20,000 patients. Then you have Chiba. 12,000 patients, close to 13,000 patients have been treated with carbon. MGH in Boston, where I was. Around 10,000, Orsay in Paris, PSI in Zurich. So these are the population numbers for the patients. And they are growing exponentially because people are starting to understand the importance of using particles. So here's an example of a treatment, which is a base of skull treatment. And on the left side, you have a treatment plan done by a colleague of mine, Oliver Jakob, with carbon ions. And on the right side, you have a treatment plan done by a former colleague of mine, Alexei Trofimov, with protons. What you notice is there is a hot area where the tumor is, and most of the brain is free from radiation. If I was to do a photon plan for this, the whole brain would be colored with this green and blue. So the whole brain would get a huge amount of radiation. In this case, carbon has a better dose distribution, but even the two are much better from a dose distribution from photons. I've just put the two of them up so that you can compare carbons to protons. But ultimately, if you compare X-rays, this whole brain would be green and blue. So a lot of background radiation for no need. Okay, so to do pediatrics, you really need a hospital that's specialized in children. And in Boston, we were very lucky that we had one of the best hospitals in children in the world, which is Boston Children's Hospital. If you have never been to a children's hospital anywhere in the world, I strongly suggest you visit. It is an amazing thing, and it is totally different from an adult hospital. I spent a lot of time working with the clinicians in Boston in this pediatric hospital, and we would then take these patients for treatment at MGH. And they had special conditions because of the way they react to treatments and how they are stressed. And many of the times they would be under anesthesia, which is also extremely complicated. Here are the centers that are specialized in pediatric: Cincinnati, Boston and MGH, Essen, St. Jude's in Memphis, St. Louis, Florida and Jacksonville. I will give examples of treatments for patients from starting with Essen. So this is the patient population of the pediatrics. And pediatrics, I'm talking about primarily 0 to about 14, 15, 16-year-olds. Okay? Essen has treated over close to 800 patients with a median age of 7 years. So imagine your child has cancer. Where would you send it for treatment? I would send it here, in fact, or Heidelberg. Most of the cancers are brain and head and neck, spinal, thoracic and abdominal, pelvis, hematopoietic. The 3 biggest regions of treatment are the CNS tumors, which are ependymoma, medulloblastoma, and glioma. In fact, in Boston, I spent a lot of time, over 3 years, working on medulloblastoma. And I will show an example in a few minutes of how you get treated for medulloblastoma. It is one of the most complicated treatments there is, this one. I spent years trying to develop it in Boston. Here's pediatrics in Heidelberg at the HIT facility. And these treatments are 400 patients over the last 10 years. In fact, it's more because this is 2016. Up to 2019, we hit 800 patients. None of these received carbon. They are all proton beams. Recently, we moved into carbon because we had the fear that carbon has much higher biological impact on the tumor and on the patient, and we haven't used carbon in pediatrics because of that. It's been primarily protons. The clinical director of the HIT facility, Professor Jürgen Dubus, has focused primarily on developing know-how with protons, and we have been treating a lot of pediatric patients. Here is the cranial spinal. Now, I'm going to spend some time here so that you understand exactly what the issue is. On the left side, you have electron beams, you have a photon beam, and then you have two types of proton beams, double scattering systems and IMPT. Both of these technologies we have in Boston, and most of the new centers will have this one on the right, IMPT. Most of the centers are focused now on IMPT. Most of the older centers like Loma Linda, MGH, Jacksonville have both. But the IMPT is let's say, the top of the range. So the immediate thing you see is the blue. You can clearly see there's a huge blue, or even green, that is affecting the whole body. So the beams are coming in from the back, entering, and the tumor is in the liquid. The cranial spinal fluid is where the cancer is. So you have to irradiate all of it. That means you have to irradiate the full spine and the brain. Now, the biggest problem of this is side effects, of course. Here, I give a large amount of radiation to the whole body. I basically give the kid a full dose of radiation that is close to an atomic bomb, right? He's going to get 23.4 gray of dose. It's a lot. It's usually divided in 1.8 gray fractions, but it's 23.4 gray dose to this red part. And if we get a cold spot in any part of the connection here, the tumor will come back. So you can see here on this side, you have all these various organs, esophagus, thyroid, heart, liver, colon, and you notice that the red and blue are always very, very high. So side effects are severe, from stomach side effects to lung, liver, digestive, you name it. So a lot of these kids, after a few months, have huge problems eating, drinking, breathing. Okay? So I'm going to come back again and say, if you have your own child, which one would you treat? Would you use the one on the left, electrons or photons, or would you prefer the one on the right? Isaiah King, which was the kid that was treated in Southampton, was offered to the parents the one here that says photons. In Southampton, they offered this treatment to the parents. And they said, this is what we can offer you, and that's it. Of course, the parents were not happy. They removed the son from the hospital, and they flew to the Czech Republic for proton therapy. And what they got was the one on the right. Any parent would do that. I mean, there is no argument about that. You would not think twice about which treatment you're going to give your kid, especially if you know the huge consequences of it. Even the treatment on the right, you still have a huge amount of brain side effects. So the kid will lose IQ values of 1 to 2 points per year. Plus, you will have some balance problems and other things. But the one on the right is better because he can eat, he can breathe, he can sleep, okay? Now, this is really the dividing point where if you want to treat cancer of pediatric patients, the reason is to avoid giving them extensive amount of radiation for no reason, okay? So I did a study with my postdoc, Paulo, and we went through all the various populations that exist in Portugal and the Portuguese-speaking countries to get an estimate of how many pediatric patients can benefit from this. So in Portugal, there's an incidence of around, in 2018, incidence of around 83 kids with the ages from 0 to 14. We stopped at 14, okay? In Boston, we considered pediatrics and young adults up to 21. So I did not go from 14 to 21. There's a bigger number. I picked a smaller number so you can get a feel for it. So the top range is 0 to 14. In Portugal, there's an incidence of 83 kids per year, and that includes BNS, Hodgkin, non-Hodgkin, kidney, thyroid, ovary, and I did not include these two. You would not, very rarely would you treat leukemia with radiation, and the other cancers I didn't know what they were, so I excluded these two. Mortality is not 21, this is the wrong number, it's 51, and that's just Portugal. If you go to Angola, for example, you have again an incidence of 100 kids. Okay? Again, I've excluded leukemia and the other cancers, which is undeclared, I don't know what they are, All these other colorful things, I added up, and I get around 100 kids in Angola that could benefit from proton therapy. Then you have Mozambique, okay? In fact, the biggest killer in Mozambique ends up being Kaposi sarcoma, which is related to HIV. So again, this is not usually treated with radiation, so I excluded Kaposi and I included these, and leukemia, and again I get over 500 kids that can benefit from proton therapy. Guinea-Bissau is another one. It's a much smaller population, but it's still there. 18 kids that can benefit from proton therapy. Now, of course, anyone in the room that's from Brazil, I did not mention Brazil because Brazil is also a huge country. But I wanted to put that number there, just so that you remember it. It is 1,500 children in Brazil that can benefit from protons. So there is a huge population that needs proton therapy. It is the population that cannot defend itself. It's the population that cannot represent itself. And many of the times, it's the parents that voice their opinion. And these parents, many of them, don't really know exactly what's the best option. So I want you guys to remember this, not as a scientist. I'm not here to tell you to be a scientist today. I want you here to be a parent and think. If your son or daughter had cancer, what would you do? Okay, now I'm going to give a reference which I think is one of the best. The NHS in the UK, in London and in Manchester have built 2 reference proton centers, and they just opened. The Manchester one is, for me, the best one in efficiency and design and the way they've implemented everything within 2 to 3 years. It's amazing. It's a reference that we should follow. They have 3 treatment rooms with gantry, with IMPT, and they have 1 experimental beamline, which you're collaborating and using for imaging, in fact. The estimate is roughly 750 patients, but this number they won't reach within 5 to 10 years. It'll take almost 8 to 10 years to reach this number. But when they do, they'll be treating 750 patients, probably more, 800, 900 patients if they're good at it. The population of this is 35% pediatrics. So the centers which cost 140 million are dedicated to children. Here you have your children environment, there you have your treatment with the pediatric patient on the couch. Children. It's a population that we forget about, and it is critical because it's the one that suffers most. Okay, so proton therapy offers a large benefit. We just have to be sure that we understand how and what to do. Pediatrics are very sensitive to small mistakes, so we have to be very good at what we do. It's just not about pressing a button. We really need to know what we're doing. Brain and CNS are the biggest problems in pediatrics, but not only, but these are the ones that suffer. I've spoken a lot about pediatrics, but a lot of the sarcomas and chondrosarcomas are also very sensitive to radiation, especially protons, and they are another population that can benefit a lot. And we should look at this as a bigger picture. It's not just Portugal. There's more countries out there that don't have conditions. The Portuguese-speaking countries, especially the ones in Africa, can benefit significantly from a good collaboration with a center in Portugal that could do something like this. So now I wanted to come back to the vision. I wanted to give you my feedback. I would like to make this vision something that you can consider. What is missing is maybe a proton center somewhere here that you can then focus on a few things. In Germany, in the US, my former boss in the US used to say, be good at one thing, but be really good at it. Don't be second or third, first. So it's important that if we are good at this, we should be good at children treatments. Everything else will come, right? So here, we should have one drive, pediatrics, to be good at treating children. If we can do that, then everything else will be fine. All right, thank you for your attention. I hope you're still awake.